Thank you very much for your cooperation, ladies and gentlemen. You've been a wonderful audience. Good afternoon. Having checked for the last time that the members of his audience were still cowering under desks or lying on the floor, Ray slowly opened the door and cautiously looked up and down the street. He had a curious feeling he was being watched. On a grey May Monday afternoon, in the lull between lunch and the school run, there were only a few shoppers, and most of them were chatting into their phones. No one noticed Ray as he quietly left the bank, carrying a bulging black canvas holdall. He hadn't worried about the bank's cameras. He knew he was unrecognisable in the balaclava because he'd worn it when he'd gone to see his mother the night before. The way she'd screamed when she opened the door. Well, if his own mother couldn't recognise him, surely no one else would be able to. He smiled at the thought, then realised he was still wearing the thing. He quickly pulled the balaclava from his head, stuffed it into his coat pocket. He tousled his hair back to its usual tangle. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced towards his car and saw the boy with blonde hair staring at him from the other side of the street. That kid should be in school, thought Ray. He didn't need to worry about a child, though. He'd done the hard part. The money was in the bag. The car was only a few steps away. He grinned at the boy, but lengthened his stride just in case. Suddenly his legs stopped working and he fell forward onto the pavement. Fortunately, he managed to twist slightly so that his shoulder, rather than his face, hit the ground first. This twist was difficult because his arms also appeared to have seized up. As he fell, which seemed to happen very slowly indeed, he was sure he caught a glimpse of the blonde boy standing in front of him. How could he have crossed the street that quickly, thought Ray, before realising that he had more important problems to worry about. He had fallen over because the laces of his shoes had been tied together in one of the largest knots he had ever seen. His arms had seized up because his wrists had been tied together behind his back. He couldn't see how big that knot was. As Ray was collapsing onto the pavement, a black holdall, balaclava, and starter pistol, which looked so much like a real gun, appeared on the desk in front of the duty officer at the local police station. The desk had been empty when PC Hatchard had looked around to see if he had remembered to switch on the kettle. There had been no one in the lobby, and he hadn't heard the door open or close, and yet the proceeds of Ray Westmore's almost successful bank robbery had appeared on the desk. There was a note. This money was stolen from the Union Bank on Cowherd Street about 5 minutes ago by a man wearing this balaclava and holding this gun. I tied him up and left him on the pavement outside the bank. Please go and get him before the bank tellers find him and start torturing him with their elastic bands. PC Hatchard reached for his radio. Yes, we've got another one. Must be the third time this week. Russell Stevens was bored. He'd been staring through the window for about 5 minutes, although it had felt like longer. It was going to be a long day, he thought. It was still at least 2 hours before lunch, and already he felt like he'd been working all day. Suddenly, he realised that something concerning him had just happened in the meeting, and that the others were staring at him. He smiled and nodded, but knew that wouldn't be enough. Clearing his throat, he reached for the control box. As the cradle slowly descended, he gave a parting wave to the men in the boardroom. He dipped his squeegee into the bucket and prepared to start cleaning the windows by the secretaries. He remembered the old days when the windows could be opened and when the nice-looking secretary used to get him a cup of tea and a biscuit. A gust of wind caught his hair and swung the cradle slightly. It didn't bother him. He'd been up in his office, as he called it, in worse conditions than this. He'd gone up when he only had to hold his arms straight out to clean the windows. The wind swung him around enough to wipe backwards and forwards across the glass. Unfortunately, this time the cable was old and frayed. Not a single one of the secretaries noticed as the cable snapped. The left side of the cradle fell away, and the floor which had been holding Russell swung to the vertical, leaving him with only a squeegee and a bucket in his hand, and nothing under his feet. Without a sound, he fell to earth. It takes so much longer in the lift, thought Russell. This way is much faster, but it's a hard trick to repeat. He wasn't sure why he was so calm. He felt as though he was flying next to his body as it plummeted to the ground. He felt disconnected from the grisly fate to which he was certainly headed. He saw people walking on the pavement and hoped he wasn't going to land on one of them. He wondered if he should be shouting or screaming. At least it would get them to move out of the way. But he couldn't bring himself to make any sound at all. He passed the 3rd floor where he thought the man sitting at the table by the window enjoying a mug of coffee and a Danish pastry might have noticed him. But he shot past too quickly to be sure. The 2nd floor had frosted glass. He'd always wondered what they did in there. There was no 1st floor on this side of the building because the reception was double height. Always took longer to clean, he thought, wistfully, since there wasn't a floor to break it up. Still, he wouldn't need to worry about it again, he thought, as he landed on the pavement. His legs didn't buckle, his body didn't break. A dog across the road barked at him, and a woman pushing a child in a buggy looked at him disapprovingly. "You should look where you're going," she said. "You can't expect me to be looking up as well as watching out for cyclists rushing along the pavement. You people, flying around on your ropes like Spider-Man, I don't know." She walked away muttering to herself as Russell checked for the 3rd, 4th and 5th times that he was not wearing a harness or a cable. He looked at his bucket. He hadn't spilt a drop of water, and his squeegee was still in there. He sat down hard on the pavement and was still there 5 minutes later when Catherine Barker finally looked up from her typing and realised that the cradle was not supposed to hang that way around and that there probably had been a person in it. Russell looked up when he heard his boss's voice. "Are you all right?" asked Larry Myerson. "I think so," said Russell slowly. "Were you in that cradle?" "I think so." "How did you get here?" "I fell, and I landed, and then I sat down." "Fell from the 14th floor?" "The one under the boardroom, is that 14? "Yes, Russell, that's 14. "OK, Larry. Well, I guess you want me to get back to work. Sorry for sitting down on the job." And with that, Russell Stevens stood up and walked back into the building, passing a man holding a mug of coffee and a Danish pastry who had come outside to see if a window cleaner really had just fallen past him as he was taking a break in the cafeteria. The boy with blonde hair, already at the next street corner, smiled and made his way back to school.